In 1519, a Spanish soldier named Hernan Cortez did something that should have gotten him executed for treason. He directly disobeyed orders from his superior, stole 11 ships, gathered 600 men who were mostly criminals and adventurers, and sailed off to conquer an empire that his own government had forbidden him from attacking. He wasn't acting on behalf of Spain. He was acting as a renegade, a pirate, a wanted man who knew that if he failed, he would be hanged as a traitor. But if he succeeded, he would become one of the richest and most powerful men in the world. What followed was one of the most brutal conquests in human history, and it would be achieved not through superior weapons or tactics, but through a weapon that Cortés didn't even know he was carrying: disease. Hernán Cortés was born in 1485 in the Spanish region of Extremadura, one of the poorest areas of Spain. He studied law briefly at the University of Salamanca, but he was restless, ambitious, and completely unsuited for a quiet life as a lawyer. At 19, he sailed to the New World seeking fortune. By 1519, he was living in Cuba, serving as the mayor of Santiago, a relatively comfortable position for a minor nobleman. But Cortés wanted more, much more. He heard rumors of a fabulously wealthy empire on the mainland of Mexico, filled with gold and silver beyond imagination, and he decided he was going to conquer it, whether anyone gave him permission or not. The governor of Cuba was Diego Velázquez, and he had his own plans for Mexico. Velázquez wanted to send an expedition to explore the mainland and establish trading relationships, nothing more. He specifically did not want a conquest. A conquest would require royal approval from Spain, massive investment, and would likely result in years of warfare. Velázquez wanted profit, not problems. He initially chose Cortés to lead a small exploratory expedition, but he quickly began to suspect that Cortés had bigger ambitions. Velázquez started hearing rumors that Cortés was gathering weapons, recruiting soldiers, and acting like a man preparing for war, not trade. The governor decided to cancel the expedition and arrest Cortés. Cortés learned that Velázquez was planning to arrest him. So in February 1519, in the middle of the night, he gathered his men and sailed out of Santiago harbor before Velázquez could stop him. It was an act of open rebellion. Cortés had stolen ships, weapons, and supplies that belonged to the governor. He had recruited men without authorization. He was now officially a criminal in the eyes of Spanish colonial authority. If he returned to Cuba without a massive success to justify his actions, he would be executed for theft, insubordination, and treason. He had no choice but to succeed or die trying, and he had decided to bet everything on conquering an empire that Europeans barely knew existed. The force that Cortés assembled was pathetically small for what he was planning. Around 600 Spanish soldiers, most of them adventurers, criminals fleeing justice, or poor men desperate for wealth. They had 13 muskets, which were primitive, slow to reload, and unreliable. 32 crossbows, which were more useful but still limited. 16 horses, which would prove to be psychologically important because the indigenous peoples had never seen horses before, and a handful of small cannons. That was it. 600 men with Renaissance-era weapons were going to attack an empire of 5 million people. It was insane. The Aztec Empire that Cortés was planning to attack was one of the most powerful civilizations in the world. The capital city, Tenochtitlan, was built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco and had a population of around 200,000 people. That made it larger than any city in Spain at the time. The empire controlled millions of people across central Mexico through a combination of military power, religious authority, and brutal intimidation. The Aztecs practiced human sacrifice on a scale that horrified even their enemies. Thousands of people were sacrificed every year, their hearts cut out on top of massive pyramids. The Aztecs believed this was necessary to keep the sun rising. Their enemies believed the Aztecs were monsters, When Cortés landed on the Mexican coast in April 1519, he did something that revealed just how committed he was to this insane plan. He burned his ships. Well, technically he had them dismantled and sunk, but the effect was the same. His men no longer had the option of retreating back to Cuba. They could only go forward into the heart of an empire that vastly outnumbered them, or die trying. It was a power move designed to force his men to fight with absolute desperation because they literally had no other choice. And it worked. With no ships to retreat to, Cortés's men knew they had to conquer or die. But Cortés had one advantage that would prove decisive. The Aztec Empire was hated by most of the people it ruled. The Aztecs demanded tribute from conquered peoples, took their young people for sacrifice, and treated subject tribes with contempt and cruelty. When Cortés began moving inland, he encountered indigenous peoples who despised the Aztecs and were willing to ally with anyone who might help them throw off Aztec rule. The most important of these allies were the Tlaxcalans, who had been resisting Aztec conquest for decades. After initially fighting the Spanish, the Tlaxcalans decided to ally with them. Suddenly, Cortés's tiny force of 600 Spaniards became a much larger army of thousands of indigenous warriors who wanted revenge. The Aztec Emperor, Montezuma II, heard reports of strange men arriving on the coast. Men with pale skin, riding giant deer that were actually horses, and carrying weapons that made sounds like thunder. Some of his advisors suggested these might be gods returning from legend. Montezuma wasn't sure what to believe, but he made a fatal mistake. He hesitated. Instead of immediately sending his army to destroy these invaders while they were still on the coast, he sent ambassadors with gifts, trying to convince them to leave. The gifts included massive amounts of gold. This was exactly the wrong approach. When Cortés saw how much gold the Aztecs had, he became even more determined to conquer them. In November 1519, Cortés and his force marched into Tenochtitlan. Montezuma, still uncertain and indecisive, welcomed them into the city as guests. This was an astonishing decision. He had just invited a foreign army, supported by thousands of warriors from tribes that hated the Aztecs, directly into his capital city. The Spanish were amazed by what they saw. Tenochtitlan was built on a series of islands connected by causeways. It had massive pyramids, floating gardens called chinampas, and a level of urban planning that rivaled anything in Europe. It was beautiful, sophisticated, and completely alien to European eyes. And Cortés immediately began planning how to destroy it. Within days of arriving in Tenochtitlan, Cortés made a move that was as bold as it was insane. He took Montezuma hostage. Using a combination of threats and manipulation, Cortés convinced the emperor to move into the Spanish quarters and effectively become a prisoner. For several months, this absurd situation continued. Cortés, a renegade Spanish criminal, held the emperor of a 5 million-person empire hostage in the emperor's own capital city, and somehow it worked. Montezuma, for reasons that historians still debate, cooperated with his captors. He continued to rule the empire, but now he was doing it while effectively being a Spanish puppet. Back in Cuba, Governor Velázquez was furious. He had sent an expedition of 19 ships and over 1,000 soldiers to arrest Cortés and bring him back to Cuba in chains. The expedition was led by Pánfilo de Narváez, who had explicit orders to capture Cortés, not to help him. When word reached Cortés that a massive Spanish force had landed on the coast with orders to arrest him, he faced a crisis. He couldn't fight the Aztecs and a Spanish army at the same time. So he made another insane decision. He left Tenochtitlan with most of his men and marched to the coast to deal with Narváez. He left only about 80 Spanish soldiers in the capital to guard Montezuma. Cortés attacked Narváez's camp at night, in the rain, achieving complete surprise. In a brief but brutal fight, Cortez's men captured Narvaez and defeated a force that outnumbered them more than 2-1. Then Cortez did something brilliant. Instead of executing his prisoners, he recruited them. He convinced Narvaez's soldiers that they could become rich if they joined him in conquering the Aztec Empire. Most of them agreed. Cortez now had a much larger force, maybe 1,500 Spanish soldiers plus thousands of indigenous allies. But while he was gone, everything in Tenochtitlan had gone catastrophically wrong. The Spanish soldiers that Cortez had left in Tenochtitlan, led by Pedro de Alvarado, had panicked. During an Aztec religious festival, Alvarado became convinced that the Aztecs were planning to attack, so he ordered his men to strike first. They sealed the exits of the temple where the festival was taking place and massacred everyone inside. Hundreds of unarmed Aztec nobles, priests and civilians were slaughtered. When word spread through the city, the Aztec population exploded in rage. By the time Cortez returned to Tenochtitlan, the Spanish were besieged in their quarters, surrounded by an entire city that wanted them dead. Cortez realized they couldn't hold out in Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs had destroyed the causeways connecting the island city to the mainland, making escape almost impossible. On the night of June 30th, 1520, Cortez ordered his men to fight their way out. What followed became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The Spanish tried to escape across a damaged causeway, while thousands of Aztec warriors attacked them from canoes. Spanish soldiers, weighed down by the gold they had looted, fell into the water and drowned. Others were captured alive and dragged away to be sacrificed. By the time the survivors reached the mainland, Cortez had lost around half of his Spanish soldiers and thousands of indigenous allies. It was a catastrophic defeat. During the chaos, Montezuma died. The exact circumstances are disputed. Spanish sources claim he was killed by his own people when he tried to calm the mob. Aztec sources suggest the Spanish murdered him when he was no longer useful. Either way, the emperor who had hesitated to destroy the Spanish when they first arrived was dead. He was replaced by his brother Cuitlahuac, who was far more decisive and aggressive. Cuitlahuac immediately began organizing the defense of the empire and planning to hunt down and destroy the retreating Spanish forces. The conquest appeared to be over. Cortez had failed, but Cortez had brought a weapon to Mexico that he didn't even know about: smallpox. One of Narvaez's soldiers had been infected with the disease when he arrived from Cuba. Smallpox was a devastating illness in Europe, but Europeans had some resistance to it after centuries of exposure. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had never encountered smallpox before. They had no immunity whatsoever. Within weeks of the Night of Sorrows, smallpox began spreading through Tenochtitlan. The results were apocalyptic. The smallpox epidemic that hit Tenochtitlan in 1520 was one of the worst disease outbreaks in human history. The symptoms were horrific: high fever, severe pain, and pustules that covered the entire body. The pustules would rupture, leaving victims covered in open, infected wounds. Many people died within days. Others lingered for weeks, suffering terribly before finally succumbing. The Aztecs had no idea what was happening. They had never seen a disease like this. Their medicines didn't work. Their gods didn't answer. People died by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands. The Spanish, watching from a distance, realized that disease was accomplishing what their weapons could not. In December 1520, just a few months after becoming emperor, Cuitlahuac died of smallpox. The man who had defeated Cortez and driven the Spanish from Tenochtitlan was dead, killed by a disease he had never encountered before. He was replaced by his nephew Cuauhtémoc, who was young, brave, and absolutely determined to resist the Spanish. But Cuauhtémoc inherited an empire that was dying. The smallpox epidemic had killed an estimated 40% of Tenochtitlan's population. The survivors were weakened, traumatized, and surrounded by enemies who saw an opportunity to finally destroy the Aztec Empire. While the Aztecs died by the thousands, Cortés spent months regrouping on the mainland. He recruited more indigenous allies, now that the Aztecs appeared weakened. He received reinforcements from Cuba and Spain, as word of his conquest attempts spread and attracted more adventurers. He built small ships that could be carried overland and assembled on Lake Texcoco, giving him control of the water around Tenochtitlan. And he waited for the smallpox epidemic to do its work. By May 1521, Cortés was ready to return to Tenochtitlan, not as a guest this time, but as a conqueror, leading an army of thousands. On May 26, 1521, Cortés began the siege of Tenochtitlan. His strategy was simple and brutal. He would cut off all supplies to the city and starve the population into surrender. The causeways connecting the island to the mainland were destroyed or blocked. Spanish ships controlled the lake, preventing anyone from bringing in food or water. The Aztecs were trapped on an island with no way to get supplies and a population already devastated by disease. Cuauhtémoc organized a fierce defense, but he was fighting an impossible battle. Within weeks, famine began killing people as fast as the disease had. The Aztecs had stored food, but not enough to feed 200,000 people, many of whom were already weakened by smallpox. People began eating anything they could find: tree bark, leather, insects. Contemporary accounts describe people so desperate with hunger that they resorted to cannibalism, eating the bodies of the dead. Children and the elderly died first, too weak to survive starvation on top of disease. And still, Cuauhtémoc refused to surrender. He knew that surrender meant the end of the Aztec Empire, so he chose to fight to the death. The siege of Tenochtitlan became a brutal urban battle. Cortés's forces advanced slowly through the city, fighting for every street, every building, every canal. The Aztec warriors fought with desperate courage, knowing they were defending their homes and families, but they were starving and outnumbered. For every Spanish soldier, there were dozens of indigenous allies from tribes that hated the Aztecs and wanted revenge. The fighting was vicious and personal. Prisoners were rarely taken. The canals ran red with blood. Buildings were torn down to deny the defenders positions to fight from. Tenochtitlan, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, was being systematically destroyed. One of the worst aspects of the siege was the water supply. Tenochtitlan got its fresh water from aqueducts that Cortés had destroyed. The population was forced to drink water from the lake, which was increasingly contaminated with sewage and corpses. This led to dysentery and other waterborne diseases, adding to the death toll from smallpox and starvation. People died with their stomachs distended from drinking contaminated water, their bodies covered in smallpox pustules, too weak from hunger to even stand. The suffering inside Tenochtitlan during those final months was almost incomprehensible. By July 1521, the population of Tenochtitlan had been reduced by more than 90%. Of the original 200,000 inhabitants, maybe 15 to 20,000 were still alive. Most of them were women, children, and men too old or sick to fight. The warriors had been killed in battle or died from disease and starvation. The streets were littered with unburied corpses because there weren't enough living people to dispose of the dead. The smell of death and decay was overwhelming. Spanish soldiers reported that they couldn't enter certain parts of the city because the stench was too powerful. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape the city by canoe, hoping to continue the fight from elsewhere. He was captured by Spanish ships on the lake. The last emperor of the Aztec Empire was brought before Cortés as a prisoner. According to Spanish accounts, Cuauhtémoc asked Cortés to kill him, saying that he had done everything possible to defend his people and his city, and now that he had failed, He wanted to die. Cortés refused to kill him immediately. Instead, he would torture Cuauhtémoc for years, trying to force him to reveal where more gold was hidden. With Cuauhtémoc captured, the remaining defenders of Tenochtitlan surrendered. The siege had lasted 75 days. The Aztec Empire, which had ruled central Mexico for nearly 200 years, was finished. Tenochtitlan lay in ruins, its canals choked with corpses, its pyramids damaged, its population dead or enslaved. The Spanish and their indigenous allies had won, but the victory had been achieved more by disease and starvation than by military prowess. Without the smallpox epidemic, Cortés would almost certainly have failed. The death toll from the conquest of the Aztec Empire is staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that around 200,000 people died during the siege of Tenochtitlan alone, most of them civilians. But the smallpox epidemic killed far more. Over the next few years, the disease spread throughout Mexico, killing an estimated 5 to 8 million indigenous people. That represents roughly 40 to 50% of the entire population of central Mexico. It was one of the worst demographic catastrophes in human history, and it was almost entirely due to disease, not warfare. Throughout all of this, we need to remember that Cortés was still technically a wanted criminal. He had disobeyed direct orders from the Governor of Cuba. He had stolen ships and supplies. He had attacked and defeated Spanish forces sent to arrest him. By the laws of colonial Spain, he should have been executed for treason. But he had also just conquered an empire and claimed millions of people and vast amounts of gold and silver for Spain. The Spanish crown faced a choice: execute him for disobedience, or pardon him and take credit for his conquest. They chose the latter. In 1522, King Charles I of Spain officially recognized Cortés's conquest and appointed him governor of New Spain. The criminal became a hero. Cortés ordered Tenochtitlan to be completely rebuilt as a Spanish colonial city, which was renamed Mexico City. Aztec temples were torn down, and their stones used to build Catholic churches. The canals were filled in to create streets for horses and carts. Spanish architecture replaced indigenous buildings. Within a generation, almost all physical traces of the Aztec Empire had been erased from the capital. Only a few ruins remained, buried under the new colonial city. The conquest was not just military and biological. It was cultural and architectural as well. The indigenous peoples who had allied with Cortés expecting to be liberated from Aztec rule quickly discovered they had simply traded one oppressor for another. The Spanish proved to be just as brutal and demanding as the Aztecs had been, if not worse. The Tlaxcalans and other allied tribes were forced to provide labor, pay tribute, and accept Spanish rule. Many were enslaved. The diseases that had devastated the Aztecs spread to the allied tribes as well, killing millions more. Within 50 years, the indigenous population of Mexico had been reduced by more than 90%. The conquest had destroyed not just the Aztec Empire, but most of indigenous Mexican civilization. Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec emperor, suffered a particularly cruel fate. Cortés became obsessed with finding more gold. He believed the Aztecs had hidden vast treasures before the fall of Tenochtitlan, so he had Cuauhtémoc tortured along with other Aztec nobles. Their feet were burned with hot coals. They were stretched on racks. They were subjected to every form of torture the Spanish could devise. Cuauhtémoc reportedly told his fellow prisoners not to give in, saying that he was not in a bath of pleasure and that torture was meaningless compared to what they had already lost. The Spanish never found the hidden gold they were looking for, probably because it never existed. In 1525, Cortés had Cuauhtémoc executed, claiming he was planning a rebellion. The conquest of the Aztec Empire had effects far beyond Mexico. It proved that European powers could conquer advanced civilizations in the Americas and extract enormous wealth. Within 20 years, Francisco Pizarro, inspired by Cortés's success, conquered the Inca Empire in South America using very similar tactics. The wealth that flowed from the Americas to Spain transformed the European economy and helped fund Spain's dominance in European politics for over a century. The conquest also established patterns of colonial exploitation and racial hierarchy that would shape the Americas for the next 500 years. Modern historians emphasize that the conquest of the Aztecs was primarily achieved through disease, not Spanish military superiority. If smallpox had not devastated Tenochtitlan, Cortés would almost certainly have been defeated. The Aztecs, even after their losses on the Night of Sorrows, still had the manpower and resources to crush the Spanish if the epidemic hadn't killed 40% of their population. The Spanish won because they accidentally brought biological weapons that the indigenous peoples had no defense against. It was conquest through unintentional germ warfare, and it was devastatingly effective. One of the greatest tragedies of the conquest was the destruction of Aztec knowledge. The Aztecs had a sophisticated writing system and had created thousands of codices, folded books containing their history, astronomy, mathematics, and religious knowledge. Spanish priests, viewing these as pagan and demonic, burned almost all of them. Of the thousands of Aztec codices that existed before the conquest, only about 15 survived. We will never know the full extent of what was lost. It was cultural genocide on a massive scale, the deliberate destruction of an entire civilization's accumulated knowledge. Cortés spent his later years in Spain, increasingly bitter and disillusioned. Despite conquering an empire, he never received the recognition and wealth he felt he deserved. The Spanish crown took most of the gold and land, leaving Cortés with a comfortable but not spectacular fortune. He tried repeatedly to gain audience with the king, to plead for more rewards and recognition, but was largely ignored. He died in 1547 at the age of 62 near Seville, having achieved one of the most remarkable military conquests in history, but ending his life feeling forgotten and unappreciated. His body was moved multiple times over the centuries, and the exact location of his remains is now disputed. Cortés's legacy is deeply contradictory. In Spain and among some Mexican historians, he is seen as a brilliant military strategist who opened up the Americas to European civilization and Christianity. In this view, he was a hero who overcame impossible odds through courage and intelligence. But to many indigenous peoples and modern historians, he is a symbol of genocide, cultural destruction, and colonial exploitation. He conquered an empire not to free its subjects, but to enslave them under a different master. He didn't bring civilization to Mexico. He destroyed one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas and replaced it with a brutal colonial regime. Both views contain elements of truth, which makes Cortés one of the most controversial figures in history. In 1519, a renegade Spanish soldier who was wanted for treason stole some ships, gathered 600 criminals and adventurers, and sailed off to conquer an empire of 5 million people without authorization from anyone. What he accomplished over the next 2 years changed the course of world history. Hernan Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire, but he did it primarily through disease, not military genius. Smallpox killed more Aztecs than Spanish swords ever did. The conquest was brutal, devastating, and resulted in the deaths of millions of indigenous people. It established Spanish rule over Mexico that would last 300 years and created cultural and racial divisions that persist to this day. Cortés was a criminal who became a conqueror, a traitor who became a hero in Spanish eyes, and a man whose actions led to one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not just a military defeat, it was the destruction of an entire civilization, accomplished more by invisible microbes than by Spanish steel. And it all began because one ambitious, ruthless man decided to disobey orders and bet everything on a conquest that everyone told him was impossible.